Hello guys, David Vose here, and it's another beautiful day, and it really is. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I've been hearing jets go over, and I don't hear them very often around here. Once in a while I'll hear a plane, maybe a little plane, or a helicopter will go by, but I rarely hear any jets or anything, even airlines or anything, once in a great while. But today they've been a flying. So I don't know. I have to wonder if it's not some kind of military exercise or something. Things might be cooking, friends, or getting ready to blow. Uh, yeah, 9th of Av is coming up, the 12th of August, friends. Well, this is part two of that video we did the day before yesterday, I guess, or something. But this is about Atlantis. And I was reading to you Critias it's an ancient book, and it's a very interesting book where Plato describes Atlantis. So we started reading that, and then we got off and talked quite a bit, and we didn't get much of it read. So I'm going to try to read the rest of it today, or at least some more of it, and we're going to talk about that. So let me start where we left off reading yesterday. But in those days, the country was fair, as now, and yielded far more abundant produce. How shall I establish my words? And what part of it can be truly called a remnant of the land that then was? The whole country is only a long promontory extending far into the sea away from the rest of the continent, while the surrounding basin of the sea is everywhere deep in the neighborhood of the shore. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time which I am speaking, and during all this time, and through so many changes, there has never been any considerable accumulation of the soil coming down from the mountains as in other places, but the earth has fallen away all around and sunk out of sight. So this 9,000 years goes back to the fall of Atlantis, which that 9,000 years started from about 2,600 BC. So that's, 12, 13,000 years ago. And that's how long this long astrological age would last when we know that Atlantis is due to rise, right? Every 12,000 years, there's this cataclysm. So there's a lot to all of this. And this is their best, as they've explained so far, this is their rendition. They don't admit that it's absolutely factual because they're rehearsing stories that was told, and we don't fully know the reality of these stories. They may be somewhat symbolic, they may be allegorical in some ways, but we trust that they tell us the story of something akin to our relation to this world and government and who we are and where we're going. This is the story, howbeit parabolic, perhaps literal in many cases, of our history, just as something like the Bible is, or the Sumerian tablets, or other ancient works. They all seem to agree that there was an ancient paradisical glory, and there were many kingdoms and many deluges, and there were many tribes and peoples, and they all seem to have some of these names that are very similar about these deities. And here we're talking about Poseidon and Atlas. As we've said, Atlas was the firstborn son of Poseidon, who received the land of Atlantis. And Atlas is also, where we get Atlantis, because he was the firstborn son. And Atlantis sunk. But the land of Enochic land is also, as we've said, Enoch is a word that's in our Bible. And Ixtlan, the native peoples call Mexico and North America Ixtlan, was from this word Atlas. And so this was probably the place of Atlantis that's beyond the gates of Gibraltar or the Pillars of Hercules in the west, following the the depths of the ocean that at one time was much bigger, and we're expecting now to rise up out of the sea in our own days. The consequence is that, in comparison of what then was, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, as in the case of small islands, all the richer and softer parts of the soil have fallen away, and the more skeleton of the land being left. But in the primitive state of the country, its mountains were high hills, covered with soil, and the plains, as they are termed by us, of Phelleus, were full of rich earth, and there was an abundance of wood in the mountains. Of this last the traces still remain, for although some of the mountains now only afford sustenance to bees, not so very long ago there were still to be seen roofs of timber cut from trees growing there, which were of a size sufficient to cover the largest houses, and there were many other high trees cultivated by man and bearing abundance food for cattle. Moreover, the land reaped the benefit of the annual rainfall, not as now losing the water which flows off the bare earth into the sea, but having an abundant supply in all places, and receiving it into herself and treasuring it up in the close clay soil. It lay off into the hollows the streams which it absorbed from the heights, providing everywhere abundant fountains and rivers, of which there may still be observed sacred memorials in places where fountains once existed, and this proves the truth of what I am saying. Such was the natural state of the country, which was cultivated, as we may well believe, by true husbandmen, who made husbandry their business, and were lovers of honor and of all the noble nature, and had a soil the best in the world, and abundance of water, and in the heaven above an excellently tempered climate. Now the city in those days were arranged on the wise. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now, for the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rocks. At the same time, there were earthquakes, and then occurred the extraordinary inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. But in primitive times, the hill of the Acropolis extended to the Eridanus and Eleusis, and included the Sphinx on one side, and the Lycabettus as the boundary on the opposite side to the Sphinx, and was all well covered with soil, and level at the top, except in one or two places. Outside the Acropolis, and under the sides of the hill, there dwelt artisans, and such of the husbandmen as were tilling the ground near. The warrior classes dwelt by themselves around the temples of Athene and Hephaestus at the summit, which moreover they had enclosed with single fence, like a garden of a single house. On the north side they had dwellings in common, and had erected halls for dining in winter, and had all the buildings which they needed for their common life, besides temples, but there was no adorning of them with gold and silver, for they made no use of these for any purpose. They took a middle course between meanness and ostentation, and built modest houses in which they and their children's children grew old, and they handed them down to others who were like themselves, always the same. But in summertime they left their gardens and gymnasia and dining halls, and then the southern side of the hill was made use of by them for the same purpose. Where the Acropolis now is, there was a fountain which was choked by the earthquake, and has left only the few small streams which still exist in the vicinity. But in those days the fountain gave an abundant supply of water for all, and of suitable temperature in summer and in winter. This is how they dwelt, being the guardians of their own citizens, and the leaders of the Hellenes, who were their willing followers. They took care to preserve the same number of men and women through all time, being so many as were required for warlike purposes, then as now, that is to say, about 20,000. So, such were the ancient Athenians, and after this manner they righteously administered their own land and the rest of the Hellas. They were renowned all over Europe and Asia for the beauty of their persons and for their many virtues of their souls. And all of the men who lived in those days, they were the most illustrious. And next, if I have not forgotten what I heard when I was a child, I will impart to you the character and origin of their adversaries. For Friends should not keep stories to themselves, but have them in common. Yet I, before proceeding further in the narrative, ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should perhaps hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquired into the meaning of the names and found that the early Egyptians, in writing them down, had translated them into their own language, and he recovered the meaning of them, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. My great-grandfather, Droppides, had an original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore, if you hear names such as are used in this country, you must not be surprised, for I have told how they came to be introduced. The tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods that they had distributed the whole earth into portions, differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices, and Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begot children by mortal women, and settled them in a part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the center of the whole land, there was a plain, which is said to have been the fairest of all plains, and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain, not very high on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife named Leucippe. And they had an only daughter who was called Cleito. The maiden had already reached womanhood. When her father and mother died, Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not as yet. He himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warmer water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. He also begot and brought up 5 pairs of twin male children, the dividing of the island of Atlantis into 10 portions. So this would be the 10 kings upon the beast that comes up out of the sea. The sea being where Atlantis was, it will come back up out of the bottomless pit in the latter days, and the 10 horns shall hate the harlot. This is what this is all talking about. You may not believe these stories of antiquity, but they are the same stories that precipitated the prophecies in our Bible. But what's really important here is that we're discovering the roots and the foundations of the Bible in all these parables. The dragon, the beast in the bottomless pit having sunk in the abyss. And now we've got the origin of the 10 horns. Yeah, there are 10 kings of Israel that are lost. And they joined with the nations, which are 10, or these, this section of Israel that went off and made another earthly, they followed the lower half, the Yahweh, the commandments. They ended up spreading that side of Judaism, or the lower carnal commandments. They were headed up by a Judean who was part of Dan, who lost his blessing because of what he did. And then they married the Canaanite Philistine princess Delilah. And this is what gave us all the royal bloodlines of the earth. The marriage of the pagan kings and the meaning just the nations, and Judea, which is the lower 2 tribes. And it was the man and the woman, and the northern tribes usually worshipped a lot of women, and the southern tribe of Judea only worshiped Yahweh and his commandments. And so we see then that the mark of the beast in Revelation is the 10 commandments. And we also see that the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit is Yahweh. And now we find out that the giants that the Bible talks about, which were the sons of Elohim that had relations with the daughters of men. And that little bird just keeps a yappy, yappy, yap. And these little birds are, this time of year, they sound like a rabbit squealing or something. I go looking for it, but it's just a little bird. So all the nations, whether they were from Shem, Ham, or Japheth, had their ancestors that were the deities. Either if you were of Ham, you would go and count your genealogy from the deity Cham or Satan or Set. If you were Japheth, you had your genealogy back to, well, any of his children back to himself, which is Poseidon. And so these mythologies are the story of our Genesis 6:4, that the sons of Elohim had relations with the daughters of men. The daughters of men were the children born after the flood. Well, originally, the line of Seth had been called the gods because Cain had been banished, and so they weren't to have relations. So Seth's children had relations with Cain and his children. And then after the flood, it was the Canaanites that they weren't to have relations with, and they forsook their natural estate, these divine deities, or the children of the deities, like children of Noah, and they had relations with Canaan, who had his genealogy through Naamah back to Cain. And the immortal ones lived almost like 1,000 years. And so Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and their 3 wives, these were the Ogdog, these were the deities that reigned over this world that we're living in now from the time of Noah. And they had relations with the children of Canaan, who were of Naamah, who goes back to Cain. And because the sin had been continued, they then were cursed all over again, as Cain had been. But then he had gone through the 7 times, and Naamah was free of that. But that line then it went on after the flood, acting in the same manner, having the same characteristics from their father. Their father is Cain. So since the devil is Saturn or Set, which is the lineage of Cain, the devil's father is Cain. Therefore, Adam, being the father of Cain, is the father of Satan and of Jesus, because, of course, Jesus came through the line of Noah. The bad guy here, Set, or Cham, and yes, his father was Noah, a good guy, but he's really counting his genealogy through Naamah back to Lamech and back to Cain. But in our Bible, it more or less concentrates more, especially with the translations we have. All you really get the sense of is these 2 deities, the devil and the father of heaven and earth. We don't even hear much about the mother because it's all mistranslated and hidden and obscured, and a lot of it has been left out. But in reality, we don't just have one deity. We have Adam, who is the first, and then all of his children. And we have another world where Noah is at the head, the father of the deities, which is the Greek Uranus and the Sumerian Anu. It is our January on the calendar, and it starts when his son Set was born. In our Bible, that is Ham, who castrated his father Uranus, or saw his father's nakedness. So this is the beginning of January, or Anu, or Noah, and this is the birth, not the birth of Noah, but the birth of Saturnalia in the dead of winter. This is the birth of Set in the Egyptian, or Satan, or Saturn in the Latin. And this starts the 3 houses up to Aries. So we have many, many layers and gradations of these individuals. There's never been a father without a father. And so I suppose even before the Absu, who is the father of Noah as well as the father of Cain and all the rest. But even he had a father. Because what is this chaos but a swirling mess, which came from this bottomless pit. There is no end to it. It's bottomless. It's the ancient, infinite past that we have no idea about and don't want to know. But as far as us here on this earth, we are dealing with these characters that are present in our world. We have chaos, we have order, we have law, which gives us some kind of order, and now we're under grace. So, Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This is the same as Uranus's kids, where it was eventually divided up from the world into Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus. Now, as we've said before, the Bible doesn't follow the exact story. As we saw in our Bible, Ham saw his father's nakedness, which had to do with usurping his bloodline or sleeping with his father's concubine or usurping the lineage. But in the Greek mythology, it's not Noah or Anu, but it's Or-Anos or Anu with the Greek ending us. So it's still Anu with the added or. Then there ends up being a dividing of the world between Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. Now, in our Bible, there is 3 sons of Noah, but Zeus is not Shem necessarily. You'll notice Osiris is killed by Set. Well, that sounds more like Cain and Abel, right? And it may have elements of that, because each time the story plays out, there are, in different generations, it plays out the dualities in different kinds of dualities. It may start with the flesh and the spirit, and then it may be the law and grace. But all these characters represent something. But we know that the 3 divisions of the earth happened after Noah, and we also know that Poseidon is spelled Japheth in some books. So we know that Poseidon is Japheth. So we know that Poseidon, the son of Uranus, and Hades, and these characters were the sons of Uranus. But in the Greek story, Zeus isn't the first born son or directly the son of Uranus, but like a grandson. But he's still his son. And while he could be Shem, because the Shem, Ham, and Japheth, it might be apropos, but as we said, he's not the direct son of Uranus, and he's not the direct firstborn son of Noah, but a couple of lines down, he's Abraham. So I've said before that in our biblical account, these father of the deities, like Uranus or Anu, the father of the gods, we also have Father Abraham. And Abraham was a contemporary with all these individuals like Nimrod and Noah. I think Noah lived like 39 years after Abraham was born, something like that. We don't have any of these father deities. We don't have very many of them in the mythology or in the Bible. In the Bible, we just have Father Noah, Father Adam, and Father Abraham. In mythology, we have Zeus, the father of the deities. We have Uranus, the father of the deities. We have a couple of others that you might consider a father. We have Saturn, which is, as we've said, would be the devil. Now, the stories are going to have the same meaning, but there's going to be possibly different symbols that will express the meaning. Instead of castrating his father, he saw his father's nakedness, as we've said. So in this case, the mythology says that Set killed Osiris, and then Isis raised him from the dead. Well, we don't have any figure in that period of time after Noah that died and was raised from the dead. Osiris portrays that story, as we've shown time and time again in the New Testament. And there's an interesting scripture in the book of Luke that talks about Lazarus being in the bosom of Abraham, which is interesting because we've always just read that it's only used, the words bosom, the bosom of someone, is only used about twice in the Bible, maybe 3 times. I think it's twice. And in the other case, it's used of Jesus being in the bosom of the Father. And yet, here we're talking about Father and Son, or even Jesus who was in the Father and the Father was in Jesus. So the bosom, it's a very strange expression. And I don't think there's any parallel. And I don't find a lot of classical Greek parallels or anything else. The bosom, you could say, is the heart, but you could also say it's the center. And the Greek word is kolpos. But the us, of course, is the Greek ending, the syntax. So it's kolp or kolup. And P's and B's are interchangeable. So now the word kolob that Joseph Smith used as the center of the universe would be a good word for the heart or the bosom, right? The center. And so I don't know. I'm just saying, I don't know if that word kolpos is kolobos. Because if you put a vowel in between the L and the P, which would be then a B, you'd have kolob. But it's just an odd word that they don't know where it came from, and they don't have any idea. All we know is that it does have the same root meaning, the center, the place where everything revolves around that. So what is the center of Abraham, or what is within Abraham in his bosom? Perhaps his seed or his another lifetime. And we did talk the other day about how Jesus said, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. So, there are some odd expressions. But another thing that's interesting about Abraham, and this is why we know that Abraham is Zeus or Osiris, even though it doesn't talk about Abraham dying and being raised up. However, the only one person in the Old Testament that at least symbolically died and was raised up is Isaac, Abraham's son. And so Yahweh tells Abraham, I want you to kill your son and sacrifice him. And Abraham goes, and the book of Hebrews says that he did it by faith, believing in the resurrection, believing that even if he died, he would be raised again. So this is another sort of parallel. It is also interesting, as we've said, that these parables in each of the mythologies or in the Bible chronology, they're similar but not exactly the same. So in our Bible, Sarah was a barren woman, and she ended up miraculously giving birth. Well, that's kind of the same, but a different way of saying it, that Isis had to give birth using the phallus of Osiris. Now, here's another interesting thing. In the sky, the star Sirius is, the us on the end, of course, his syntax is Sira. And that is the same as Sarah. And that is the Egyptian Sirius or Isis. So it's Isis's husband is Osiris. And this is the constellation we call Orion. It arises in the spring, coming up out of the duat or hell or the bottom of the wheel in spring, which is a resurrection. Osiris, Lazarus, being risen from the dead by Horus. Now, we don't just know that Sira sounds a little bit like Sarah or Sirius, but the ancient stories and books confirm that these two are the same person, just spelled slightly different or from a different language. And scholars will admit that Sirius is the same as Sarah. It's also the same word that we have the Asherah, right? And Asherah was supposed to have been married to the Heavenly Father, but somehow or another ends up at some point being married to Yahweh, because Yahweh ended up divorcing her. But what we have here is the story of Father Molech, or Abimelech, Abi, Father Molech, the king of the Canaanites, who greeted Abraham and Sarah, and he wanted Sarah to be his wife. Now, we've talked about how there was something strange that happened there. Sarah had been barren, couldn't have kids with Abraham, but she stays for a while with Abimelech, and then the angel said, you give her back to Abraham, and when she goes back to Abraham, she's miraculously pregnant with Isaac. And it's Isaac that is supposed to be, miraculously brought back from the dead, according to the book of Hebrews, by faith. So it is the same story, but it's just using a different narrative or occurrences to explain kind of the same thing. And so we know then that Father Abraham is Father Zeus, or in the Egyptian, Osiris, who died and rose again by faith, because through the receiving of Isaac from the dead, which probably represents Jesus coming back to life, his father, Jesus's father, then allowed him to die, knowing that he would be brought back. The same, in a sense, happened with Osiris, who, even though he died and was raised up by his son Horus, Horus himself was raised from the dead. So there are lots of similarities to these stories. So we can be reasonably certain that Father Abraham is Father Zeus. Now, we see that Zeus becomes the ruler of Mount Olympus over the Olympians, and they go and have a war with the Titans. Of course, the Titans are the giants in the Bible, and Abraham certainly did have a war, and we talked about that. And then, in a sense, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continued on with these wars, conquering the promised land, and even King David killing Goliath, the giant. So I think what's going on here is that when Poseidon got the Isles of the Sea, it was probably Europe in that area that we have always thought. But Poseidon lived before the flood. And he originally then lived in America, where Atlantis was. And Noah, of course, lived in America for the flood. And then they lived there like 600 years. So Atlas, being Poseidon's firstborn son, must be some child, one of these 10 kings that will come up out of the bottomless pit, which will be some kind of prophetic idea of America coming up now in the latter days. It's very possible that more land will raise up and Atlantis will eventually actually rise from the depths of the sea. But at least in some way, America has risen to prominence in the latter days, and it has become the home of the Gentiles. And so it's very apropos, and there's a lot we could say and go into on that angle. But we've got to continue on here, because I'm giving you a brief idea of the fact that Atlantis was in America, was beyond the gates of Gibraltar or the Pillars of Hercules. So what we're finding out here is this Poseidon is Japheth. Now, Ham in our Bible is the Set or the Satan. Okay? It says that Japheth will live in Shem's tent. Specifically, it says deity shall enlarge Japheth's tent, or stretch out his tent and make it bigger. Perhaps to America eventually, the Gentiles came, and he will dwell in Shem's tent. So America is the land really of Shem, because Shem is the one who will get the inheritance, and he gets the whole world. Canaan shall be his servant. So really, there's only one inheritance, and it's given to Shem. Shem has the whole world, right? Even though it was divided, the heavens and the earth and the sea, between these three. But the whole world, or the middle ground, which is the earth, is given to Shem, where you put tents, on the earth. And Japheth will live in his tent. So he gets to live in his tent, but his tent is going to be expanded, or the Gentiles are going to expand all around the world. The 10 horns of Gog and Magog They'll come up out of the bottomless pit in the latter days. Atlantis will rise, and the 10 tribes that are lost will, some of them, form this lower earthly kingdom and combine themselves with Gog of Magog. So this is this thing about the Gentiles. Remember the Gentiles, when they come in, well, they got the islands of the sea, and the biggest island was Atlantis, which is basically where we're at now, this little part of the world that wasn't known to them, but was originally where Atlantis was, and before that, the Garden of Eden. But we have to understand here, who's the devil? Is it Ham or is it Japheth? Well, there seems to be a combination of the two, because all the pictures with the devil has a pitchfork. Well, what is the pitchfork? The pitchfork is the trident, which is what Poseidon has. He has the trident. You've got this period of time where Anu reigns, and this is January. So this is at the bottom of the wheel, and there's 3 houses of water. But before that, there was Scorpio, and lustful Sagittarian horses are representing lust, or they're very carnal beings, not yet raised up to become the Aquaman, right? And then eventually the Lamb and the Orion, the warrior that rises on the horizon. But you see, what we're seeing here is that Satan isn't like Cain or something way back before the flood. But Satan is Set, and this is after the flood. So before the flood, which, remember, that is the 3 houses of water starting from December 25th, or January and February and March. So before that, there's the Scorpio and Serpens and Sagittarius and the judgment of Libra. Now, that is what the Bible would call Hades, or death. And death and Hades followed them. So they're in front. This beast is in front. And then behind the beast is, because it's mirroring, it's the dragon, the original serpent. So the original serpent was actually a woman, Tiamat, time and matter. And that's kind of like, well, Tiamat was married to Absu, right? The abyss, the bottomless pit. And that is the very beginning. These are deities from before. But the Bible doesn't say that Yahweh was that original, like, dragon. Yahweh is the beast, which is Satan, which is Saturn or Set or Ham, that was born right when Noah came across over through the flood. The reason that Saturnalius or Set or Satan was born in December 25th, that's the winter solstice at the bottom of the wheel, and it divides the bottom of the wheel in half. There are 3 houses on one side and 3 houses on the other. So Noah, being January, John the baptizer, he's going to reign for those 3 kingdoms, except that Satan, his son Ham, stole the birthright from him. And so we've had all this trouble and the fighting between the 2 sons. And then Abraham gets the promise. And this is the whole story, but told differently in the Greek mythology. But we got to talk about what's before that, during the 3 houses in Hades, because Hades has the key to death. So the Bible does talk about Hades all the time. We just call it hell, right? So Jesus went through the area of the sea for 3 days and 3 nights, because Jonah went through, in the belly of the whale, a mammal went through the sea, which is the sea beast. And that's the 3 days from Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. It has nothing to do with that other bottomless pit and the fire and the sulfur, or the holes in the earth where the serpents and scorpions and the lustful horses live, or the judgment of Libra. So Father Noah yes, he was 600 years old when the flood came, so he existed before the flood during Atlantis. But it was after Atlantis that John becomes the ruler, or Anu, and he's the father of the deities now because everybody's gone. They all went into the bottomless pit. The world drowned. Atlantis drowned, and Poseidon went down into the bottomless pit. But he had 10 horns. He had 10 the Gog of Magog, which is there are 10 of these deities that are sons of Poseidon, and that's Gog of Magog, because Gog is one of the children, according to the Bible, of Japheth, and according to Greek mythology, of Poseidon. So Poseidon, then, his kingdom, that was this kingdom of our Father in heaven, Anu, he reigns and he guides us through these waters until we get to the sands of the sea, or Ares, and the beast rises out of this. He's gone through this, and he rises out of the abyss onto the land. And he comes up out of the bottomless pit, or out of the sea. So that can be no other than Poseidon, which is the beast, which Yahweh claims to be. However, remember, before Anu reigned, there was the original father, which is the Absu. And the Absu was chaos. And so Uranus got his son, Yahweh, to defeat chaos by giving its order, or the law. And it was a schoolmaster that led to Christ. So Anu rules over the sea and the land. And before him, over the bottomless pit, or the abyss, was his father. Anu's not the first father, Chaos. This bottomless pit, which is from Libra to Capricorn, the scorpions and the serpents, and the judgment of the scales of Libra, the famine, the pestilence, and this is death. This is death and Hades that follow behind. And in the front is the white horse. Well, Yahweh, or the Antichrist, it's his son that he inhabits, is the white horse, the Antichrist. And Yahweh, then, who reigns for a while, usurping his father Uranus's throne. So he is Cham, who usurps Uranus's throne. I think sometimes we just speak generally and we say, well, Hades has a pitchfork, he's like the devil down there in hell. But actually, hell is at the bottomless pit, Tartarus. You see, the Bible talks about the pits of hell. There's more than one, and there's layers, and the regions of Hades in the book, the New Testament. So the bottom of the wheel, where would that be? Well, it's a little bit deceptive when you're looking at a round sphere, because from the bottom of the wheel, you start going up, actually, to get to spring. You're actually going down. When you get to Libra, you're going literally down into the bottomless pit. And so that is where, right as you're leaving the bottomless pit, that is where Satan is born, or Yahweh. But chaos was before him. And death and hell are down to the bottom, because as you're going down through Virgo and Libra, and you're going down the wheel, the very bottom, you see, is on the Scorpio and Sagittarius. So that would be the bottomless pit. Now, once you go past January, or December 25th, actually, now you're going up the mountain. You're up Mount Sinai, and you're advancing through the fish, the birds, the mammals, the men, and this is the classroom of Yahweh. He's not as bad as we've been told, because there might even be a worse devil, the original serpent, which is the dragon Tiamat. And most, mythologies actually say that that was a woman. Yeah. So for those of you who think that deity is a woman, well, she might be. Maybe the original one was. And the Gnostics called her Barbelos, but they didn't say she was evil, of course. But there are different ways or parables of looking at all of this. So, and she wasn't alone. She was married to a man named Absu, which is the bottomless pit or the abyss. Well, that's because the dragon that lives in the bottomless pit came out and started going in through the sea and finally makes it to the sands of the seashore, which is in Aries, which is in our day, when he's going to come up out of the bottomless pit, out of the sea, and try to come up on land. But that's as far as he goes, because Jesus, dun, 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 and the 144,000 will meet him there. And there will be a battle, and the Titans will be fully and completely thrown back into the abyss where they belong. So, what is the dragon? I mean, who is the dragon? Well, Tiamat. Okay, it has 7 heads and 10 horns. Well, the 10 horns have got to be these 10 kings, Gog of Magog. And that is a child of Poseidon or Japheth. Because it was the Gentile, these kings, these deities, that had relations with the daughters of men, which is the Canaanites. And remember, there were 7 Canaanite nations. And so the Canaanites came up out of the bottomless pit already. Back then, once Atlantis fell, here they come again with 7 heads and 10 horns, like Cain, and now it's Canaan. Cain has become 7 times worse. Remember, Lamech said that if Cain shall be punished 7 times, then I, his son, who murdered again, will be punished 70 times 7. And so now we've got this beast. It's not just, the beast man, Cain, which is what the rabbis say his mark, his punishment was to be hairy, like a beast. So he's a dragon or a monster, which is really some amalgamation of animals. And he's the original serpent. And this is not the one that was the wisest of all the creatures that the Lord had made, but this was literally Yahweh. Either it is Yahweh or it's Yahweh's father or something of that sort, but I wouldn't be surprised if Cain, which is Yahweh, is also Satan or Set or Ham in the next life, his next reincarnation. Literally rising out of the bottomless pit. And so the 7 heads of the dragon is the Canaanites, the 7 nations of Canaan. And remember, Canaan was up there in Syria, the Philistines. This is why we call it Palestine, they say. And it really means Stein or Satan, right? The kingdom or palace of Set. Well, the Phoenicians lived up there in Syria, around Tyre and Sidon. The Bible tells us that Dan got that northern area and married, his son Samson, who was part of the tribe of Judah and partly of the tribe of Dan, married Delilah, which is the Phoenician Canaanite woman. So the Canaanites sort of then mixed with Judah and Dan. And this area is the area of Japheth, the Isles of the Sea. So they were all mixed together. You got the 10 horns that are on the beast that represent the 10 kings of Gog and Magog, as well as the 10 tribes of Israel. And that would include a wedding between the Canaanites from Ham and the Gentiles from Japheth and Poseidon, as well as the children of Israel being mixed, the 10 tribes being mixed with these 10 kings. So that just as we all get our inheritance in one tribe, we all can trace ourselves back to the other bad side, to the carnal nature. We all have Esau and Jacob in us. We've all got Cain and Abel in us, the spirit and the flesh. This is kind of odd, though, because so far in our story, what we have is that Satan is a relatively recent deity, as well as our Heavenly Father Noah. And we haven't even talked much about Adam, but we have talked about Cain vaguely, because we're talking about the great dragon. Now, Yahweh in the book of Isaiah claims to have killed the twisted serpent in the sea. This is a story that's throughout all the mythologies and the Bible. And so the dragon is the twisted serpent. It also uses that expression in Isaiah, the twisted serpent. And so we know who it is, and it's spoken of in the Greek mythologies and the Sumerian and so forth. So Tiamat was, there's a whole book about it. Velenkowski wrote this book. He claims it was a big asteroid, and some people think it was Nibiru or whatever, we had a big collision of planets, and it was the 7 planets. Well, there's a lot to that too, but we're not going to get into that side of it. It was that ancient chaos when the planets were just forming. That's where that part of the bottomless pit is. It's way in the past. But one of the meanings then would be the beast coming out of the bottomless pit would be, that there would be chaos all over again. And we don't want that, and certainly that's not going to happen. But he's always lurking, isn't he? That chaos. And of course, we've got to go through some small part of chaos once again, ever so often, just to remember what it is. And that's about what we're going to go through here during the tribulation. But it'll, after it's raised its ugly head, dun, 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 the Olympians will fight the Titans and it'll be fine. But the fact that Yahweh in the book of Isaiah claims to be the one who killed the Tiamat, or the serpent, the twisted serpent that was in the abyss, well, that proves that Yahweh, or Satan, is a more recent deity. And this other worse deity, remember, in the Sumerian story, it's Enki who goes and kills Absu and then puts his throne in the abyss. And Enki rules over the abyss. So even though Enki was from a different time, probably before the flood, of course, but he was around when Absu was around, because he's the one who killed him in the story. In the Sumerian story, it's Enki who kills Absu. So in our Bible, we see that it is the deity Yahweh that kills this Tiamat and her husband Absu. Well, he never really kills the dragon. That's why we're still, dealing with him in the book of Revelation. He couldn't kill the dragon, but he did get the Absu and put his throne there. So he kind of works with the dragon. Yahweh works with the dragon. That's his mommy. So the evil mother of all is Yahweh's mommy. And so Yahweh and the original dragon, they're working hand in hand. And so Yahweh, or Enki, also was represented as a serpent. And there were several serpents in that garden, 2 of which are Niningzida and Dumuzi. Dumuzi is the good guy, the shepherd, the good shepherd. And he's spoken of in the Old Testament in Isaiah as Tammuz. And it says they are weeping for Tammuz. And Yahweh didn't like it because that was his brother. And they liked his brother more than him. Well, Tammuz, they were weeping for him because he had died, and they didn't know about the resurrection yet. So this is something that they did to celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who was called the Dumuzi. But they're both serpents. The Bible calls them seraphim, and each one has 6 wings, and they surround the throne and say, "Holy, holy." Well, the 6 wings on each side is, of course, astrology. And so that's the light and the darkness, the day and the night, and that's Satan and Jesus. And so I'm looking down, and it looks like we're probably close to an hour, so I'm going to stop it here. I had intended to read all of this Critias to you, where Plato and these individuals are talking about Atlantis, but we didn't get that far because we got into a discussion and a syncretism, if you will, putting all these gods and deities together. But anyway, I'm going to leave it here. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. It's getting late. I got to get this uploaded. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Lord will bless you. Have a good one.